there, I'm Andrew, you're watching ThatGamerAjax, and welcome to the latest Veil of the Void class guide. This time we're going to be discussing the Architect. Now, Architects are kind of that general, smart, big-brained, build everything kind of class. If you're familiar with the Artificer in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, this is very, very similar to that, though with a really great sci-fi twist. Because it kind of focuses a little bit more on being a almost support style class, it's not particularly combat focused, but when it comes to creative possibilities, there is nothing better than this class in this game. So let's go ahead and dive right on in to some of the strengths of this class. So as mentioned in the intro, the Architect is the actual build everything kind of class. It has a unique mechanic that is called scrap. Now this is something that you start the game with a little bit of scrap, and you can use that scrap to build a variety of tools and armors and resources. Basically, if you can imagine it, you can probably build it. Now, what you're wanting to build is going to, depend on the difficulty check that you need to succeed. Now, along with the scrap mechanic, you get scrap back by, you can find scrap from enemies that drop. You can start tearing stuff apart, and really, there's a little bit of risk reward associated with it. The bigger thing that you want to try to tear down and store that scrap for to turn into something else later, it's going to be a little bit harder, but you're going to get a lot more for it, so you don't have to restock as often. Now, a fun fact, the prototype species in this game can actually scrap parts of their own body because they are already, made of metal. However, you're going to take a loss of maximum HP in order to do so, and that doesn't come back for quite a while, and there are special steps that you have to take if this is what you want to do. Now, this is a class that is going to be very important that you work with your game master on, just because there are a ton of possibilities. Now, you're limited in the number of scrap created things that you can carry, so make sure that you're also kind of planning ahead. Do you want something that's going to be big? Well, you're only going to be able to carry one of those. Or do you need smaller things like lockpicks at any kind of given moment? You can build those and they'll be ready to go. You can carry more of the small things. But again, it's just kind of managing your overall inventory. Now, personally, I think that the Architect is a class that, because of the nature of it, because you are that kind of inventor, you like to build things, you have a lot of roleplay mechanics already built into your kit. The more levels in Architect that you have, the access to bots that can help you out also increases, meaning that you can kind of have these helpful little drones that are kind of going around and helping you whenever you need them. Now, usually you can only have one bot at any given time that has a variety of functions, but if you decide to specialize, you can increase that number, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. Now, speaking of these bots, they serve a variety of functions, such as being able to heal allies, pull enemies into certain sections, they can guard areas for you and zap anything that comes nearby with a contested check against your mentality score, so the more points that you have in that, the easier it is for your bot to succeed. And some of them later in the game are even able to teleport either yourself or an ally using parts of your movement speed. So they serve a wide variety of functions. Now, something that's very important when you're playing an Architect is going to be your positioning and the positioning of your bots. If you have played something similar in a different role-playing game where you have a familiar or you're controlling a pet or something like that, this will be a very, very similar mechanic to you. However, if you're new to the game, this is something that you're really going to want to keep in mind, and keep a couple of sheets separate so that way you have those ready to go any given time with what your bot does and what those stats are. So personally, this is something that I would just recommend doing as a little extra step for yourself as a player. Now, let's also talk about some of the overall weaknesses now that are associated with the Architect. Now, personally, I know that the Architect has some combat bonuses to it, but I do not believe that the Architect is going to be one of the better fighting style classes that you're going to have in this game. You start with only, maybe a medium armor at most, and you're really only good with one-handed ranged weapons, which means that you're not going to be overly great in a fight. Now, you can sit back and support just fine, and eventually you're able to kind of tinker and help your allies with all kinds of mechanical buffs. However, you yourself are not going to be the major damage dealer in the game. So if you're okay with playing a support, this is definitely the class that's going to be for you. Now, while it's not necessarily a weakness in and of itself, the Architect is really going to thrive when you have a game master that is willing to really work with you on the inventions that you are going to want to have. So make sure that you really sit down and explain to your GM what you are wanting to do with this class when you are playing it. Make sure that you guys establish, the overall goals and kind of the know-how of your character before the game even gets started. And when you're inventing things, there's always going to be a risk and reward associated with it. Now, unfortunately, how that risk looks like as an Architect is that there is a chance for any one of your inventions to explode. Now, if something does explode, anything that's nearby, yourself, your allies, enemies, other things in the environment that could be good or bad, depending on the situation, are going to receive that damage as well. So keep this in mind that there's always going to be a risk of you critically failing and your invention exploding. Now, lastly, let's talk about the specializations for the architect. Now, first is the spec tech. Now, earlier I mentioned that you can only have one bot out at a time. Now, if you decide to play spec tech, you can kind of bend those rules a little bit. Now, as a spec tech, you gain access to a little commander drone that allows you to start controlling more and more drones. This will make it so that way you can have multiple out on the battlefield, and they all share your turn, so that way you have a lot that you're able to do. Personally, I've seen one player use this before to devastating effects, and it is a very effective specialization. Next, you have the technician. Now, technicians, rather than relying on their drones or the bots, they kind of focus on building things themselves. With this, you get access to more scrap. The maximum that you can hold is increased, and you're able to start building specialized pieces of equipment between armors and weapons. You can even start building your own ships and mechs. Now, there are rules to how long that's going to take you to do, but it now becomes a possibility for you that other architects aren't really able to do. Eventually, you are also able to start adding cybernetic enhancements to yourself that will allow you to have a variety of different bonuses that would almost be magical in nature if it was any other game. And lastly, you have the Tinkerer. Now, Tinkerers are a little bit unique when it comes to the architect because you kind of focus on improving what already exists. You're not necessarily there to reinvent the wheel, but you're going to make the best wheel possible. How this works in the game is that you're able to start adding a lot of bonuses to your allies when it comes to the gear that they have. You know, you can increase armor ratings. You can make it so enemies have a harder time seeing them. You can also reduce some difficulty checks associated with your ships. Like if you're going to try warping across the galaxy, you can actually reduce that down to the easiest possible number if possible. Now, eventually the technician also gets a small little robotic helper to help you out when you're doing all these tinkering checks. And I gotta say that the art for this guy is adorable. So in conclusion, if you are the kind of player that really likes taking crafting rules and pushing them to their absolute limit, this is going to be the class for you in terms of Veil of the Void. If you like playing the Artificer in Dungeons & Dragons, this is going to be a very easy transition for you. Both classes are relatively similar, though you're not really making magic items necessarily. You just have access to a lot of things that you can build, and really your creativity is going to be the only limit to this. So that is going to wrap up this class guide, and I just wanted to end it with a couple of questions. Like one, have you ever heard of an Architect style class outside of the Artificer from Dungeons & Dragons? And if you've played one of these style classes before, what's the coolest thing that you've ever made? What's something that you would like to try to make in a sci-fi universe like Veil of the Void? So if you have any answers to these questions, comment below, let me know. And if you enjoyed the video, please give it that thumbs up. And if you haven't already, maybe consider subscribing. So until then, I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.